I want you to close your eyes for a second and just try to imagine a place.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
So imagine a place where you can stand in these ancient fossilized footprints of a massive predatory dinosaur.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Right. And then after a remarkably short drive, you can physically start digging for diamonds in the crater of a dormant volcano.
That sounds made up.
It totally does. But hold that image for a second. Now imagine a place where back in the mid-19th century, state legislators literally settled arguments over bunking policy by pulling out Bowie knives.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, and just fighting to the death right there on the House floor,
Yeah.
surrounded by all their colleagues.
That is just wild.
It's crazy. And then if you fast forward just a few decades from that, imagine a landscape so utterly devastated by, like, biblical level floods and crippling droughts that it completely rewrote the rule book on how rugged, independent citizens interact with the federal government.
Honestly, it sounds less like a real geographical location and more like, I don't know, the setting for some incredibly dense historical novel.
Right.
You've got radical environmental extremes, intense political blood feuds, and this geographical variety that just logically shouldn't exist all in one place.
But it does.
Yeah.
Because we are actually just talking about a single American state.
We are. We're talking about Arkansas.
Exactly. We are talking about Arkansas. And our mission today is to explore the turbulent, fascinating, and honestly just mind-blowing history of this state.
Yeah, it really is.
And we are using this brilliantly detailed source, Arkansas, A Narrative History, as our map for this deep dive.
It's a great book.
It is. We're going to trace the evolution of this land from its deep geological formation all the way through the crucible of the Civil War and the absolute trials of the Great Depression.
And you know, the value of diving into this specific source material is how it absolutely refuses to separate the history of the people from the history of the dirt they stand on.
Yeah, the land is like a character.
It really is. It forces us to look at how environmental extremes, incredibly diverse geography, and some of the deepest political divides imaginable have constantly, forged and tested the people who call Arkansas home.
And sometimes broken them.
Yeah, sometimes totally broken them.
So why should you care about this specific slice of the American map? Well, whether you are a hardcore history buff or someone fascinated by the sheer mechanics of how geography dictates politics,
which is huge here.
Massive, or even if you're just a curious mind who loves an unbelievable story, this deep dive is going to give you an unparalleled understanding of how a so-called frontier state transforms over millions of years.
It's basically a masterclass in how the land shapes the people.
Right, and how the people try, often completely in vain, to tame the land. But okay, let's unpack this. We need to go way, way back.
Like deep time.
Yeah, deep time. Millions of years before the first human footprint was ever left in the mud.
To really understand the mechanics of Arkansas, we literally have to start roughly 500 million years ago.
500 million years.
Exactly. At that point, all of present-day Arkansas was underwater.
Like all of it.
Every inch. It was completely submerged by the shallow marine waters of what we now call the Gulf of Mexico.
Wow.
And it was this environment just teeming with prehistoric life. And as those billions of sea creatures lived and died over, eons, their shells drifted down and formed an incredibly thick layer of bottom sediment.
Right, which becomes rock.
Exactly. Over millions of years of immense pressure, that sediment compressed into solid limestone, and that limestone is literally the foundational bedrock for a massive portion of the state today.
But, geology rarely stays quiet forever.
No, it does not.
Around 300 million years ago, things got incredibly violent because you have ancient continents crashing into each other to form the supercontinent Pangea.
And that specific tectonic collision is the defining mechanism for Arkansas's geography and, frankly, its entire future.
How so?
Well, when those massive land masses collided, the immense kinetic energy basically crumpled the Earth's crust. It thrust the land in the northern and western parts of present-day Arkansas violently upward.
Okay.
Meanwhile, the land in the southern and eastern parts, it wasn't pushed up. It remained underwater for a much, much longer geological period.
Oh, I see.
Right. So by the time those southern and eastern waters finally receded, which was only roughly a million years ago, they left behind a flat, rolling landscape that looked exactly like what it had been for eons.
An ocean floor.
Exactly. An ocean floor.
So the state is basically born with this profound structural schism.
Totally.
You end up with a distinct diagonal line running roughly from the northeast corner down to the southwest corner of the state.
Right.
North and west of that line, you have the mountainous uplands.
Yeah.
South and east of that line, you have the flat, rolling lowlands.
But our source makes it really clear that even the highlands versus lowlands binary is it's a bit of a simplification.
Because it's more complex than that.
Yeah, there are actually 6 distinct natural divisions that emerge from all this geological chaos.
That nuance is crucial. Within the highlands, you have 3 distinct divisions. You've got the Ozark Mountains, the Ouachita Mountains, and the Arkansas River Valley, carving a path right between them.
Right.
And then down in the lowlands, you also have 3 divisions. The West Gulf Coastal Plain, the Mississippi Alluvial Plain, which most people just call the Delta, and a highly unusual elevated strip running right through the Delta called Crowley's Ridge.
I want to spend a minute on the sheer physical variety of these regions because the contrast is just wild.
Let's do it.
So let's look at the Ozarks in the north. The tectonic uplift there basically pushed up massive flat plateaus of rock, the Springfield, Salem, and Boston plateaus.
Okay.
And because the rock was pushed straight up, the rivers had to act like chainsaws. They were just carving deep, incredibly steep valleys through that ancient limestone bedrock over millions of years.
Wow, like chainsaws. That's a great image.
Yeah, and that creates a landscape of hardwood forests, sheer bluffs, super clear rivers like the Buffalo, and, massive underground caves dissolving right out of the limestone.
But then, if you look at the Ouachita Mountains just to the south, the mechanics of their creation were entirely different.
Looked entirely different. They weren't just pushed straight up.
Yeah.
The tectonic collision literally folded the layers of sedimentary rock, like a rug being shoved against a wall.
And that folding mechanism creates a totally different topography.
Right. Instead of flat plateaus carved by rivers, the Ouachitas are characterized by long east-to-west running ridges.
Oh, okay.
And the geological folding had another really fascinating side effect. Rainwater seeps down deep into the fractures of those folded rocks, gets superheated by the Earth's geothermal gradient,
Right.
and eventually bubbles back up to the surface along the fault lines.
Which gives us the famous hot springs.
Exactly.
You have literal boiling water just coming out of the side of a mountain.
It's incredible.
But then you leave the highlands entirely, and you drop down into the West Gulf Coastal Plain in the southwest part of the state.
Right. Whole different world.
Because this area stayed a shallow, swampy lagoon for so long after the highlands were formed, the fossil record is completely different.
Right.
This is the exact environment where paleontologists discovered the tracks of dinosaurs near present-day Nashville, Arkansas.
Which is so cool.
We are talking about the fossilized footprints of the Acrocanthosaurus, which was one of the largest apex predators to ever walk the North American continent.
And incredibly, not far from those dinosaur tracks, near Murfreesboro, you have the site of an ancient, violent volcanic pipe explosion.
Wait, a volcano in Arkansas?
Yeah, it pushed magma from deep within the Earth's mantle right to the surface. And it left behind thousands of diamonds in the dirt.
It's literally a geological playground.
It really is. And if you move over to the eastern third of the state, the Delta, you enter a completely different world governed by completely different natural forces.
Right, because the delta wasn't shaped by tectonic folding or volcanoes.
No, it was shaped by ice and water. During the melting of the last Ice Age glaciers, massive volumes of glacial outwash rushed down the Mississippi River basin.
Just a ridiculous amount of water.
Yeah. Over thousands of years, these floods deposited incredibly deep, rich alluvial sediment. We're talking hundreds of feet of topsoil.
Hundreds of feet.
Yeah, it created an incredibly flat landscape, historically covered in dense, impenetrable swamps and these massive cane breaks.
And sitting right in the middle of that perfectly flat delta is Crowley's Ridge.
Which makes no sense when you look at a map.
It really doesn't. It's this narrow, elevated strip standing sometimes 200 feet above the flatlands around it.
Yeah.
And the mechanism of its creation is fascinating because it wasn't pushed up from below. It was actually built from above.
Right, by wind-blown dust.
Exactly, looses.
Yeah.
Accumulating on a sliver of land that the ancient rivers somehow just failed to wash away.
When you look at this sheer diversity, it's really no wonder early European and American observers were completely stunned by the potential of the region.
Yeah, they must have been blown away.
They were. The source mentions Albert Pike, a prominent early figure, writing in 1835 that the soil of the Arkansas bottoms was, quote, inferior to none in the world.
High praise.
And the writer Thomas Banks Thorpe famously called it the creation state and the finishing up country.
What does it mean?
He was making the joke that the soil was so deep it practically ran down to the center of the earth.
Huh. So basically, a tectonic plate shift hundreds of millions of years ago predetermined the entire sociopolitical future of the people who would eventually live there.
Completely.
That diagonal line dividing the highlands and the lowlands isn't just a geographical trivia fact, it's the invisible fence that dictates human culture in the state.
What's fascinating here is that it is the single most important variable in Arkansas history.
Okay, let's look at the mechanics of why that is.
Well, the Ozarks and Ouachitas, they have cooler temperatures, rugged, difficult terrain, and much thinner, rockier soil.
Right.
If you settle there in the 18th or 19th century, the environment naturally dictates a very specific way of life. You cannot physically grow massive fields of cash crops.
The land just won't let you?
Exactly. You are forced into small-scale subsistence farming, supplemented by hunting and foraging.
Which breeds a very specific culture.
Right, an isolated, highly localized, and fiercely independent hill country culture.
But the lowlands?
The lowlands, particularly the Delta, present the exact opposite economic incentive.
Because of that deep topsoil.
You have this incredibly fertile, deep alluvial soil and a significantly longer, hotter growing season. That environment practically begs for large-scale, plantation-style agriculture.
And in the 19th century American South, plantation agriculture meant one thing.
It meant an absolute reliance on enslaved labor to cultivate and harvest cash crops, primarily cotton.
So you're saying a tectonic collision hundreds of millions of years ago basically pre-programmed the state's political and cultural divides for the 19th and 20th centuries.
I am. You have two entirely different economic systems, two deeply conflicting social structures, and two different political ideologies packed into one arbitrary state boundary.
It's a geographical powder keg.
Geography is destiny here. That geographic schism will eventually influence everything from slavery to secession to New Deal politics.
The land itself is the primary author of the history.
It really is.
And just as the physical bedrock was shaped by violent natural forces, the human settlement of this land was shaped by massive cultural collisions and natural disasters.
Yeah, by the early 19th century, the geopolitical map of North America was undergoing its own tectonic shift, bringing Arkansas out of its ancient isolation and right into the crosshairs of an expanding American empire.
And that shift happens precisely in 1803, when the United States acquires the vast, largely unmapped Louisiana territory from France.
The Louisiana Purchase.
Right. Suddenly, President Thomas Jefferson has doubled the size of the country, and he urgently needs to figure out exactly what he just bought, who currently lives there, and, crucially, where the actual borders are.
We all learn about Lewis and Clark heading northwest to the Pacific, you know.
Sure.
But Jefferson had another equally important mission in mind for the southern portion of the purchase. He wanted an expedition to navigate up the Red River, which he believed would help establish the southern boundary between the new American territory and the Spanish Empire.
But Jefferson's grand vision for the Red River immediately collided with the realities of early American governance.
It did. He faced two massive hurdles. First, the Spanish government, which still controlled Texas and Mexico, was highly suspicious of American expansion.
Very suspicious.
They viewed any heavily armed expedition near their borders as an act of aggression and made it clear they would likely arrest or attack an American party on the Red River.
And the second hurdle?
Congress was incredibly stingy.
Huh. Some things never change.
Right. They completely refused to properly fund a massive military expedition into contested territory.
So Jefferson is forced to pivot. He scales down his ambitions and decides to send a smaller, cheaper, and less geopolitically provocative expedition up the Ouachita River instead.
Ostensibly to scientifically explore the famous hot springs he had heard murmurs about.
Right. He taps William Dunbar, who was a wealthy Mississippi planter and amateur scientist, and George Hunter, a Philadelphia chemist, to lead it.
And Dunbar and Hunter spent the winter of 1804 to 1805 navigating the Ouachita.
And while their journey didn't cement a place in popular mythology like Lewis and Clark,
No, definitely not.
their meticulous scientific reports were a massive revelation to Washington, because they proved that this region was not some empty, pristine wilderness just waiting to be discovered.
Exactly. They documented an incredibly complex, pre-existing socio-political system.
Right. They found a world where French and Spanish hunters, trappers, and traders were deeply intertwined with shifting Native American populations.
For a brief period, this region functioned as what historians classify as a middle ground.
What exactly does that mean, a middle ground?
It's a fascinating historical concept. It describes a geopolitical space where no single group, neither the indigenous tribes nor the European empires, has the absolute military or demographic power to dominate the others.
Okay.
So because domination is physically impossible, collaboration becomes absolutely necessary for survival.
Makes sense.
In Arkansas, this meant the Quapaw tribe, the French and the Spanish were forced to trade, intermarry, negotiate, and basically borrow culturally from one another. It was a delicate, constantly shifting balance of power.
But the moment the ink dried on the Louisiana Purchase, a ticking clock was placed on that middle ground.
Its days were numbered.
As the United States aggressively secured its territory east of the Mississippi River, it adopted a policy of pushing eastern Native American tribes westward, treating the newly acquired Louisiana territory as basically a massive dumping ground for indigenous populations they no longer wanted in places like Georgia and Tennessee.
Jefferson actually envisioned the Arkansas region as an ideal place to resettle those eastern tribes. But that sweeping federal plan completely ignored the messy, on-the-ground reality.
Which was that Arkansas was already fully occupied.
Right. You had the Quapaw, who had cultivated rich agricultural lands along the rivers for centuries. You had the powerful Osage Nation fiercely defending their massive hunting grounds in the northern and western highlands.
And now the federal government was pushing tribes like the Cherokee into the area, demanding they carve out new lives in lands already claimed by the Osage and Quapaw.
It was a recipe for disaster. And to ignite this already volatile situation, white American settlers began pouring into the territory.
And let's be totally clear about the economic incentives driving these settlers. They had absolutely no interest in maintaining a delicate middle ground of cultural exchange.
Zero interest.
They were driven by the exploding global demand for cotton. They wanted land, specifically the rich alluvial river valley lands, to clear-cut, plow, and plant.
And they viewed the Native American populations not as trading partners, but as obstacles to be removed.
The political pressure from white settlers to forcibly remove the indigenous tribes was mounting rapidly. But before that political machinery could fully execute its goals, the region was struck by an environmental catastrophe so immense that it literally altered the physical map of the territory.
We are talking about the New Madrid earthquakes of 1811 and 1812.
The historical accounts of these quakes are genuinely terrifying.
They are. These weren't just tremors. These were some of the most powerful seismic events ever recorded in the history of North America. The epicenter was near New Madrid, Missouri, but the destructive force rippled violently down through northeast Arkansas.
The physical mechanics of the destruction were apocalyptic. The earth didn't just shake. Eyewitnesses described the ground physically rolling in massive waves, like an ocean swell.
Yeah, the immense pressure caused the sandy soil to actually liquefy.
Liquefy, like quicksand.
Sort of. The ground ripped open in massive fissures, violently spewing geysers of pressurized water, sand, and sulfuric gas high into the air.
That's horrific.
The banks of the Mississippi River collapsed into the current. Whole islands were swallowed whole, and perhaps most dramatically, massive tracts of land in northeast Arkansas literally subsided.
They sank.
They sank, creating a vast, permanently flooded region that became known as the Sunk Lands.
It was a disaster that wiped out entire settlements, drowned livestock, and fundamentally traumatized the residents. I mean, many white settlers and Native Americans abandoned the region entirely, convinced the land was just cursed.
But the true historical twist of the New Madrid earthquakes isn't the destruction itself.
Right. It's the federal government's attempt to provide relief, which ended up triggering a massive demographic explosion.
This is a classic example of unintended legislative consequences. In 1815, Congress passed the New Madrid Act. It was essentially the first disaster relief bill in American history.
Wow, the first one.
Yeah. The mechanism was simple in theory. If you could prove your land was rendered uninhabitable by the earthquakes, the government would issue you a land certificate.
Okay, that sounds helpful.
It does. This certificate allowed you to claim an equivalent amount of public land elsewhere in the Missouri or Arkansas territories. The goal was to help traumatized farmers relocate and start over.
Wait, so a massive natural disaster actually sped up the population boom and the push for statehood?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Because Congress completely underestimated the predatory ingenuity of land speculators.
Oh, of course.
Imagine you are a terrified farmer in 1815. Your fields are underwater, your cabin is gone, and you are starving today. The government hands you a piece of paper that says you have the right to claim 160 acres of unmapped land hundreds of miles away, but only after you navigate a labyrinth of federal surveying and legal paperwork.
It was practically useless to the immediate victims.
completely useless. So wealthy land speculators from cities like St. Louis swooped in. They approached these desperate, ruined farmers and offered them cold, hard cash for their certificates.
Often buying them for absolute pennies on the dollar.
Exactly. The speculator would then take a massive stack of these deeply discounted New Madrid certificates down to the Arkansas Territory and use them to legally claim the most valuable, prime riverfront agricultural land available.
So an act designed to help earthquake victims was legally manipulated to create a massive land rush that flooded Arkansas with new, heavily capitalized settlers and speculators.
Yeah. The population numbers show the immediate impact. The non-Indian population of Arkansas skyrocketed from roughly 1,000 in 1810 to over 14,000 by 1820.
That is a massive jump.
It is. This sudden, explosive demographic growth made it glaringly obvious to Washington that Arkansas could no longer be managed as a distant outpost of the Missouri Territory. So, in 1819, Congress officially carved out the territory of Arkansas.
And the establishment of a formal territorial government was basically the death knell for the remaining Native American populations.
Sadly, yes.
The rapidly expanding white population simply demanded the land, utilizing their new political power to leverage the federal government.
The Quapaw, who had been steadfast, peaceful allies to the Americans, were coerced into signing treaties that stripped them of their incredibly valuable plantation lands in the Southeast.
And they were eventually pushed into a disastrous relocation down to the Red River in Louisiana, where they faced starvation, flooding, and despair.
And the Osage were systematically pushed out of their western hunting grounds and relocated to Indian Territory in present-day Oklahoma.
The tragedy of the Cherokee removal is particularly striking, though, because the Cherokee in Arkansas had strategically adapted to the American system.
They really had. They built log cabins, established large-scale farms, adopted American agricultural techniques, and even established schools.
They did everything they were supposed to do to, quote, assimilate.
Right. But none of it mattered. Their land was just too valuable. By 1828, they too were forced out and relocated to Oklahoma.
The nuanced, collaborative middle ground of the 18th century was entirely erased, replaced by an aggressive, monolithic push for white dominance and cotton expansion.
And as the territory grew and the indigenous populations were removed, the internal white political structure basically devolved into bitter, violently competitive factions.
Because without the stabilizing presence of established national political parties, territorial politics in Arkansas became deeply personal, driven by personality, patronage, and family ties.
You saw the emergence of two incredibly hostile camps.
On one side, you have the political juggernaut known as the Democratic family, or sometimes just the dynasty.
Right.
This wasn't a traditional political party. It was an entrenched alliance tied together by literal blood and marriage. It was dominated by figures like the Conway brothers, Benjamin Johnson, and Ambrose Sevier.
They were fierce Jacksonian Democrats, aligning themselves with the populist states' rights ideology of Andrew Jackson.
And opposing the family was the Whig faction, initially spearheaded by a brilliant, highly ambitious young territorial secretary named Robert Crittenden.
The Whigs generally favored a stronger, more active national government, supporting a national bank and federal funding for internal improvements like roads and canals.
But the ideological differences were secondary to the pure, unadulterated hatred these two factions had for each other.
Oh, absolutely. Their rivalries went far beyond standard political campaigning. They frequently devolved into slander in the partisan newspapers, vicious street brawls, and formal, deadly duels.
Despite this chaotic, violent political culture, the population continued to surge. By the early 1830s, the push for statehood became the dominant obsession of the territorial leadership.
But when we look at who exactly was pushing for statehood, that ancient geological divide rears its head again.
Of course it does.
It was not a unified grassroots movement of the people.
No, statehood was an elite project heavily driven by the wealthy planter class concentrated in the southeastern lowlands.
For them, statehood wasn't about patriotic pride. It was a highly calculated strategic move to secure their political power and, most importantly, to protect the economic engine of their wealth.
Slavery.
Exactly, the institution of slavery. At the national level, the balance of power between free and slave states in the U.S. Senate was becoming the defining existential conflict of the era.
The mechanism that triggered statehood is fascinating. Michigan, a free territory, was applying for statehood.
Right.
Ambrose Sevier, the territorial delegate for Arkansas and a leading figure in the family, recognized the national political calculus. The South needed a slave state to balance Michigan.
So without even waiting for formal instructions or a referendum from his constituents back in Arkansas, Sevier unilaterally initiated the push in Washington to admit Arkansas as a slave state.
But before they could be admitted, they had to draft a state constitution. And it was during the 1836 Constitutional Convention that the internal geographical fault line cracked wide open.
Yeah, the planters from the southeastern lowlands had a massive problem. They controlled the vast majority of the wealth and the enslaved population, but they had a significantly smaller population of free white voting men compared to the rugged upland farmers in the Northwest.
So if representation in the new state legislature was based purely on the number of free white citizens, the planters would be politically outnumbered by the upland farmers.
Exactly. And they feared the Highlanders would tax their slaves and land to pay for roads and schools in the mountains. So the planters demanded that representation be calculated using the 3/5 rule.
Now, wait. Anyone familiar with American history knows the 3/5 compromise from the drafting of the U.S. Constitution, where southern states demanded enslaved people be counted as 3/5 of a person for federal representation.
Right.
But what's crucial here is how the planters weaponized that exact same concept internally against their fellow Arkansans.
It's incredibly cynical.
They wanted the 3/5 rule applied to the state legislature, meaning a planter in the Delta with 100 enslaved people would wield vastly more voting power than a subsistence farmer in the Ozarks.
The delegates from the Northwest Highlands saw exactly what was happening and fought back fiercely. They argued that the planters were trying to build an oligarchy. They demanded that representation be based strictly on the free white population, plain and simple.
The convention nearly collapsed over this issue.
It almost fell apart.
Ultimately, the planters, utilizing their immense wealth and political leverage, engineered a deeply flawed compromise. They agreed to base the lower house on the free white population satisfying in the Northwest, but they manipulated the districts of the state Senate to guarantee the planter-dominated Southeast disproportionate power.
They structurally rigged the new state government to protect plantation slavery from the upland farmers.
So, through political maneuvering in Washington and gerrymandering at home, the statehood mission was accomplished. Arkansas officially entered the Union as the 25th state in June 1836.
The planters got their star on the flag and their political protection.
But getting the star on the flag was the easy part, because actually running a state requires immense capital. And paying for the state while keeping its hot-blooded politicians from killing each other was another story entirely.
Yeah, the hangover of statehood hit instantly. Arkansas was, economically speaking, completely insolvent.
Just broke.
As a territory, the federal government had covered the heavy costs of administration, salaries, and infrastructure. Now, as a sovereign state, Arkansas had to fund itself.
But they were trapped in an economic void. They had very few public assets left to sell, a relatively small cash-poor population to tax, and there was not a single capitalized bank operating within the state's borders to provide the credit necessary for large-scale economic development.
So the very first state legislature decides they need to artificially inject credit into the economy. The newly drafted state constitution explicitly allowed them to charter 2 state-backed banks, and they wasted no time. They created the State Bank of Arkansas to handle government funds and promote general mercantile business. And they created a much more ambitious entity called the Real Estate Bank of Arkansas.
To understand the economic disaster that followed, we really have to look closely at the incredibly precarious mechanics of the real estate bank.
It was a mess.
It was an institution designed primarily by, and exclusively for, the wealthy planter elite. Here is how the mechanism worked. The state didn't actually have gold or silver to put into the bank.
Right.
Instead, the bank allowed wealthy landowners to buy stock using their land as collateral. If you owned a massive plantation, you could pledge the deed to the bank, and in return, you became a stockholder.
Which sounds somewhat logical until you realize the next step. Once you were a stockholder, the bank allowed you to borrow paper money printed by the bank itself, up to half the value of the land you just pledged.
But where did the bank get the actual value to back up this paper money?
That was the fatal flaw. The state government issued millions of dollars in sovereign state bonds to capitalize the bank. They essentially used the full faith and credit of the newly minted state of Arkansas to guarantee the bank's debts.
Okay.
They sold these state bonds to investors in New York and London to bring in hard currency.
Here's where it gets really interesting. It's like an incredibly toxic financial loop. It is essentially giving a teenager a credit card, letting the teenager set their own credit limit. But the teenager is also armed with a Bowie knife and zero supervision.
That is a terrifying but completely accurate analogy. Because the people running the bank were the exact same planters borrowing the money, the system was immediately corrupted.
Precisely.
Yeah.
The directors of the real estate bank engaged in rampant favoritism and absurd financial manipulation. They systematically inflated the appraised value of their own land to secure massive unsecured loans.
The source provides a staggering example regarding Ambrose Sevier, the powerful politician we discussed earlier. Sevier owned land that, for the purpose of paying property taxes to the state, was assessed at roughly $14,000. But when Sevier wanted a loan from the real estate bank, a bank controlled by his political allies, that exact same land was magically appraised at $32,000.
That's convenient.
He received a massive loan based on phantom equity.
And the timing of this massive speculative bubble was catastrophic. The state's credit reputation was utterly annihilated.
And they would spend decades mired in complex, agonizing litigation over these defaulted bonds.
The banking debacle didn't just ruin the economy, though. It created an atmosphere of bitter, furious resentment within the legislature. And that resentment directly triggered one of the most infamous, shocking episodes of political violence in American history.
It really is unbelievable.
It happened during a special legislative session in the fall of 1837, held in the brand-new, partially finished state capitol building in Little Rock.
The tension in the room was palpable. You have the Speaker of the House, a man named John Wilson. Now, crucially, Wilson is not just a powerful politician. He also serves as the president of the real estate bank.
Conflict of interest.
Huge conflict. He is intimately tied to the corruption and the failing institution. During a tense debate over a bill regarding the bounties paid for killing wolves, a representative named J.J. Anthony, who was a vocal, fierce critic of the real estate bank, takes the floor.
Anthony sees an opportunity to mock the speaker. He sarcastically proposes an amendment, suggesting that the hides of the recently killed wolves should be officially signed by the president of the real estate bank.
Basically implying that a wolf pelt would be far more legitimate currency than the worthless paper money Wilson's bank was printing.
Wilson, sitting at the speaker's podium, takes this as an intolerable personal insult to his honor and a direct attack on his bank. He furiously orders Anthony to sit down and yield the floor.
And Anthony, standing his ground, refuses.
At that moment, all decorum vanishes. Speaker Wilson draws a massive Bowie knife, steps down from the podium, and aggressively charges down the aisle toward Representative Anthony right in the middle of the legislative session.
Just unbelievable.
Anthony sees him coming, draws his own knife, and they clash in front of the horrified legislature. Anthony strikes Wilson, but then drops his knife. Wilson immediately lunges and violently stabs Anthony in the chest, killing him almost instantly on the floor of the House.
The Speaker of the House murders a sitting representative during a debate over banking policy.
And the aftermath is almost more shocking than the murder itself.
It really is. Because of his immense political connections within the Democratic family, Wilson was not held accountable in any meaningful way. His trial for murder was an absolute sham. He was acquitted by a sympathetic jury on the grounds of self-defense, despite being the one who initiated the charge.
And wait, he was reelected, right?
Yeah. While he was expelled from the legislature for the session, the voters of his home county actually reelected him to the House just a few years later.
It is a staggering illustration of how deeply ingrained violence was in the political culture. And it wasn't an isolated anomaly. The political elite frequently bypassed the courts and settled disputes through the highly ritualized violence of the code duello.
Duels were incredibly common.
For example, in 1844, a Democratic newspaper editor named Solon Borland engaged in a vicious street brawl in Little Rock with a rival Whig editor named Benjamin Borden. Borden felt his honor was impugned and formally challenged Borland to a duel.
They traveled across the border into Indian territory to evade local laws, and Borland shot Borden in the chest. Borden survived, but this was simply the accepted cost of doing politics in Arkansas. When you look at these events from the perspective of an outsider, the image of Arkansas was terrifying. If you were a banker in Philadelphia or a merchant in New York reading the Telegraph reports, Arkansas sounded less like a functioning democracy and more like a lawless, blood-soaked frontier overrun by homicidal politicians.
Right.
This constant stream of high-profile violence firmly cemented the state's national reputation for backwardness and barbarity.
And that negative political reputation was compounded and permanently seared into the national consciousness by a piece of wildly popular culture that emerged during the exact same period.
The enduring myth of the Arkansas traveler.
The evolution of the Arkansas traveler perfectly demonstrates how cultural stereotypes are weaponized. Originally, it was an inside joke.
Right. It was a humorous story and fiddle tune created by a wealthy, educated Arkansas planter named Sanford Faulkner, based on a genuine encounter he had while lost campaigning in the Ozarks.
In Faulkner's original telling, an urbane, slightly arrogant planter gets lost and stumbles upon a rugged log cabin. He engages in a rapid-fire, witty, and highly sarcastic banter with the squatter living there.
And the squatter continually outsmarts the wealthy planter with deadpan humor.
But the nuance of that interaction was completely lost when the story was published and picked up by the massive Eastern media machine.
Right. The Eastern publishers fundamentally altered the narrative to fit their preconceived biases. As the story was co-opted, reprinted, and performed in minstrel shows across the country, the sophisticated Arkansas planter character was erased and replaced by an outsider, a civilized traveler from the East.
That change meant the witty, sarcastic squatter, who was depicted as uneducated, living in squalor, drinking corn whiskey, and endlessly playing the fiddle, was left to represent the entirety of the Arkansas population.
It crystallized the enduring, deeply damaging stereotype of the poor, ignorant, shiftless, backwoods hillbilly.
The state found itself trapped. It was incredibly difficult to shake an early cultural stereotype manufactured by Eastern newspapers, especially when the state's politicians kept getting into knife fights and duels, seemingly validating every terrible thing the East Coast believed about them.
But while the reputation for violence was a heavy burden, the violence itself was about to scale up to an unimaginable level.
Because the internal geographic and political divides we discussed, the planter elite in the Delta versus the upland farmers in the Ozarks, were about to literally tear the state apart.
As the national crisis over slavery reached its breaking point following the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860, the internal divisions within Arkansas became painfully evident. Despite the political dominance of the Southeast planters, secession was not an immediate foregone conclusion.
When the initial state secession convention met in March 1861, the conservative delegates, predominantly representing the northern and western highlands, actually held the majority.
Which is really interesting. Why were the Highlanders resistant to secession?
It comes back to the geography we discussed in Section 1. The farmers in the Ozarks and Wakitas owned very few enslaved people. Their economy was based on subsistence, not global cotton exports.
Right. They had absolutely no economic incentive to destroy the Union, risk federal invasion, and shed their own blood merely to protect the financial investments of the arrogant lowland planters they already resented.
So they voted the Ordinance of Secession down.
The conservative stance was essentially conditional unionism. They would remain loyal to the United States, provided the federal government did not attempt to use military force to coerce the Deep South states that had already seceded.
But that fragile condition was shattered in April 1861 when Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter. President Lincoln immediately issued a call for troops from all remaining states to suppress the rebellion.
That call for troops was the fatal spark. Even the staunch conditional unionists in Arkansas felt they could not and would not take up arms and march against their fellow Southerners.
The convention hastily reconvened in May, and the political calculus had entirely shifted. With the threat of federal coercion now a reality, the convention voted overwhelmingly to secede and join the Confederacy.
But an overwhelming vote in convention of politicians did not equal unanimous consent among the citizens of the state.
Not at all.
While secession triggered massive, enthusiastic celebrations in the southern and eastern plantation districts, with young men rushing to enlist in local militias, the mountainous regions in the north-central part of the state remained a hotbed of deep-seated, stubborn unionist sentiment.
The resistance in the mountains wasn't just passive grumbling, it became highly organized. This brings us to a remarkable detail in our source, the Arkansas Peace Society.
Right.
In late 1861, deep in the Ozark Hollows, citizens in several north-central counties formed a clandestine underground organization dedicated to actively resisting the Confederate war effort and protecting themselves from forced conscription.
The mechanics of the Peace Society highlight how deeply fractured the local society had become. They operated like a secret resistance movement, utilizing secret handshakes, specific passwords, and clandestine nighttime meetings to organize their members.
Their goal was essentially to opt out of a war they felt was forced upon them by the planter elite.
However, secrecy in a rural, highly polarized community is almost impossible to maintain. A member got cold feet, betrayed the group, and informed the local Confederate militia authorities.
The Confederate response was swift and brutal. The local militias rounded up the suspected members of the Peace Society. But they didn't just arrest them. They subjected them to a humiliating, terrifying ordeal.
What did they do?
They physically chained 78 of these men together in pairs and marched them under heavy guard all the way down from the mountains to the Capitol in Little Rock.
Wow.
When they arrived, the Confederate authorities gave them a stark, horrific ultimatum. Enlist in the Confederate Army immediately, or face a military tribunal and likely execution for treason.
Faced with the gallows, the vast majority of the Peace Society members chose to enlist to save their own lives. However, their forced loyalty was utterly hollow.
Naturally.
Many of these men waited for their first opportunity in the field and deserted, slipping back into the mountains or crossing the lines to join the Federal Army.
It points to a staggering statistic that defines Arkansas's Civil War experience. Despite having a very small white population, Arkansas ultimately provided more troops for the Federal Union Army than any other Confederate state except Tennessee.
The state was fundamentally fighting a bitter, intimate war with itself.
But regardless of the internal resistance, Arkansas was geographically vital to the broader Confederate strategy. It served as a massive western buffer, protecting the vital states of Texas and Louisiana, and it provided a strategic staging ground for Confederate attempts to invade and conquer the divided state of Missouri to the north.
And the pivotal clash to control this western theater came early in the war, in March 1862, at the Battle of Pea Ridge in the extreme northwest corner of the state.
The Battle of Pea Ridge was a strategic catastrophe for the Confederacy. A Federal army, commanded by General Samuel Curtis, had aggressively pushed down from Missouri into Arkansas.
Right.
The Confederate forces, led by General Earl Van Dorn, attempted a highly complex, aggressive flanking maneuver designed to envelop and destroy the Union Army.
But poor coordination, harsh terrain, and the death of key Confederate generals on the battlefield led to a complete collapse of the Confederate assault. Van Dorn's army was defeated and forced into a chaotic retreat.
The Federal victory at Pea Ridge permanently secured Missouri for the Union and established an unshakable Federal foothold in northwest Arkansas. But the true disaster for Arkansas wasn't the battle itself.
No, it was the strategic decision made by the Confederate High Command immediately afterward.
Following orders from his superiors in Richmond, who were desperate to reinforce the eastern theater of the war, General Van Dorn made a monumental decision. He essentially packed up his entire fighting force.
He stripped the state of its able-bodied fighting men, seized all available horses and mules, emptied the armories of weapons and ammunition, and marched his army across the Mississippi River to fight in Tennessee.
Wait, so the Confederate High Command basically abandoned Arkansas to save the eastern theater. How did the civilian population even survive that level of abandonment?
They barely survived at all. Van Dorn's departure left the vast majority of Arkansas utterly defenseless. General Curtis and his Union Army recognized that the path was completely open. They began a slow, methodical march southeast through the state toward the capital, Little Rock.
However, Curtis's supply lines, stretching back to Missouri, were vulnerable and frequently cut. To sustain his massive army, Curtis issued a devastating order. His troops were to live off the land.
This marks the descent into total war. The Union Army swept through the rich agricultural districts like a plague of locusts. They systematically stripped farms of their livestock, emptied smokehouses and barns of all food, and burned any infrastructure mills, cotton gins, bridges that could potentially be useful to the Confederate war effort.
They left a trail of absolute destitution in their wake.
And as Curtis's army marched through the plantation districts of the Delta, the enslaved population recognized their moment of liberation. Even though President Lincoln had not yet issued the Emancipation Proclamation, thousands of enslaved black Arkansans made the perilous decision to abandon the plantations, fleeing their captors and following the Union Army columns to claim their freedom.
The entire agricultural economy, which was utterly dependent on coerced labor, collapsed instantly.
With the regular Confederate Army gone and the Union Army moving through, the state completely lost any semblance of civil authority. It descended into a terrifying anarchy.
Desperate to maintain some resistance, Confederate military authorities authorized the formation of independent partisan ranger companies to harass Union supply lines.
While some of these units operated as legitimate guerrilla fighters, the lack of oversight meant that the partisan war quickly devolved into sheer banditry. The countryside became infested with heavily armed bands known universally as bushwhackers, claiming Confederate sympathies, and jayhawkers, claiming Union sympathies.
In reality, ideology meant very little. These armed bands preyed on civilians of all political stripes, robbing, murdering, and burning out families to settle old pre-war grudges.
If you lived outside the heavy fortifications of the major towns, you were entirely at the mercy of raiders from both sides. Law and order evaporated.
The absolute, merciless brutality of this conflict is perfectly encapsulated by the Camden Expedition in the spring of 1864. This was a massive failed Union offensive aimed at capturing Shreveport, Louisiana, by marching through southern Arkansas.
During the agonizing Union retreat back toward Little Rock, a highly significant engagement occurred known as the Battle of Poison Spring.
Poison Spring stands out for its horrific racial violence. A massive Union supply train foraging for desperately needed food was guarded largely by the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry, a regiment composed heavily of formerly enslaved black men who had enlisted to fight for their freedom.
And a superior Confederate cavalry force ambushed the train.
When the overwhelmed Union lines finally broke and retreated, the Confederate soldiers, who were absolutely enraged by the sight of armed, uniformed black men fighting against them, refused to accept surrenders. They implemented a terrifying no-quarter policy on the battlefield.
It was a massacre. Confederate soldiers actively hunted down wounded and surrendering black soldiers, executing them in the mud.
The casualty disparity highlights the execution-style violence. The 1st Kansas lost nearly half its men killed or wounded, a staggering loss rate for a single brief engagement. It demonstrated the sheer visceral hatred driving the conflict in Arkansas.
By the time the formal Confederate surrender finally came in 1865, Arkansas wasn't just defeated. It was fundamentally erased as a functioning society.
The physical infrastructure was completely destroyed. The plantation economy, built on the abhorrent foundation of human bondage, was shattered.
Thousands of young men were dead or maimed, massive tracts of land lay fallow, property values had plummeted to zero, and literal starvation stalked entire counties.
The pre-war social hierarchy had been completely upended, and the state faced an agonizing, decades-long struggle simply to rebuild the most basic functions of civilization.
And rebuilding from the absolute ashes of the Civil War leads us directly into a deeply conflicted new era. As Arkansas limped into the 20th century, the state was seized by a desperate, overarching desire for progress and modernization.
But that progressive vision clashed violently with the deeply entrenched, unyielding social prejudices of the white majority.
Historian Jack Kirby coined a perfect, haunting phrase for this specific era in the South. He called it darkness at the dawning.
It perfectly captures the profound contradiction of the time. On one hand, you have the energetic progressive era, a push by reformers to modernize the archaic state government, build paved roads, dramatically expand public education, and tackle horrifying public health crises.
But running parallel to that modernization, and often spearheaded by the exact same politicians, was the systematic codification of a virulent new racism.
This was the era that actively constructed the legal machinery of Jim Crow segregation and methodically disenfranchised the black voting population.
The human embodiment of this darkness at the dawning contradiction in Arkansas was Governor Jeff Davis.
Not the Confederate president, a different Jeff Davis.
Right, Governor Jeff Davis. Davis was a masterful, highly intuitive, populist politician. He recognized the deep, simmering resentments of the poor, rural white farmers who felt entirely left behind by the state's slow economic recovery.
He campaigned in a rumpled gray alpaca suit, deliberately appealing to the one-gallus country farmers, and he launched blistering, highly theatrical political attacks against the wealthy urban elites, banks, and big corporations in Little Rock.
He genuinely championed the rural poor, expanding funding for charitable institutions and attacking corporate monopolies. But the dark side of his populist strategy was how he fueled his political rise by utilizing incredibly divisive, incendiary racial rhetoric.
He actively promoted white supremacy, championed the segregation of public spaces, and consistently inflamed racial tensions to solidify his voting base among poor whites, ensuring that the progress he fought for was strictly racially exclusive.
While Davis dominated the political rhetoric, the actual physical landscape of the state was undergoing massive, rapid economic shifts. The railroads, heavily subsidized by the state, had finally penetrated the isolated regions of the state, unlocking massive, untouched reserves of ancient timber.
Arkansas suddenly experienced a staggering lumber boom. Massive, highly capitalized logging operations moved in, clear-cutting millions of acres of virgin pine and hardwood forests, fundamentally altering the highland ecosystem.
And down in the Delta, an equally massive environmental reengineering project was underway. Ambitious, wealthy planters realized that if they could just drain the remaining millions of acres of mosquito-infested swamps, they would have access to the richest, deepest agricultural land on the North American continent.
So they utilized the state legislature to create powerful, localized drainage districts.
The mechanics of these drainage districts were remarkable. The districts had the power to levy taxes and issue massive bonds to fund incredible feats of engineering.
They brought in steam-powered dredges to dig hundreds of miles of massive canals, effectively pulling the stagnant water away from the land and dumping it into the major river systems.
It was an absolute environmental catastrophe for the wetlands and the massive populations of migratory birds that relied on them, but from an economic perspective, it was a miracle.
It allowed the planters to massively expand the plantation system, planting millions of new acres of cotton. Simultaneously, the early 20th century saw the rise of massive industrial company towns like Bauxite, Arkansas.
Bauxite is a fascinating case study in industrial control. The town was built entirely around the mining of bauxite ore, which is the primary component used to smelt aluminum.
The massive aluminum corporations didn't just build a mine, they built the entire society.
Exactly.
Right.
The company owned the houses the workers rented, they owned the stores where the workers bought their groceries, they funded the schools, and they built the roads.
It brought cash wages to a poor state, but it required workers to surrender almost total control of their lives to the corporation.
This era of rapid, unregulated industrial and agricultural expansion also brought terrifying public health crises to the forefront. This raises an important question, right? When you suddenly bring thousands of poor rural workers into tight, unsanitary quarters and lumber camps and isolated company towns, infectious disease runs rampant.
How do you keep a workforce healthy when the state government has virtually no public health infrastructure whatsoever?
It was a monumental challenge, and initially the state couldn't handle it alone. They had to rely on outside, heavily funded progressive organizations. The Rockefeller Sanitary Commission, for example, came into Arkansas to wage war on hookworm.
Hookworm is a debilitating parasite contracted through bare feet and contaminated soil, and it was causing severe anemia and lethargy in a massive percentage of rural children.
The Red Cross also arrived to battle pellagra, a highly lethal disease caused by severe dietary deficiency. But while outside charities helped, the state government occasionally had to step in with the incredibly heavy hand of the law to prevent widespread panic.
Our source details a terrifying localized incident in 1913 that illustrates this panic. A highly contagious, deeply lethal outbreak of spinal meningitis struck a crowded lumber camp to the small town of Lepanto in northeast Arkansas.
The mortality rate was terrifying. The newly created State Board of Health, desperate to prevent the outbreak from sweeping across the region, was forced to enact strict armed quarantines, sealing off the town to stop the spread.
The public hysteria surrounding the Lepanto outbreak was intense. Neighboring states, terrified of the infection crossing the borders, reacted with extreme prejudice.
The source notes a specific, heartbreaking case of a woman named Della Dick Abbott who attempted to flee the quarantine zone. When she reached the Missouri border, hysterical local officials not only turned her back at gunpoint, but seized and burned all of her worldly possessions right there on the road, convinced the items carried the disease.
It feels like the entire progressive era in Arkansas was an exercise in building a shiny, modern house on a deeply compromised, crumbling foundation. They were spending massive amounts of money trying to build paved roads, expand public education, and mandate public health, but they were entirely ignoring and systematically suppressing a huge, vital portion of their own population.
And that systemic racial suppression inevitably reached a breaking point, exploding into horrific, disproportionate violence. The most tragic, stark illustration of the absolute limits of Arkansas's progressive reform occurred in the fall of 1919 with the Elaine race riot in Phillips County.
Based strictly on the historical record detailed in our source, the roots of the violence were fundamentally economic. African-American sharecroppers in the Delta region around Elaine were locked in a deeply exploitative system, perpetually indebted to white planters who controlled the weighing and selling of their cotton crops.
Desperate for fair compensation, the sharecroppers made a highly dangerous decision in the Jim Crow South. They formed a union to collectively demand better financial settlements, and they pooled their money to hire a prominent white attorney from Little Rock to legally represent them.
The white planters viewed the unionization of black sharecroppers not just as an economic threat, but as an existential threat to the entire social order of the Delta. The tension escalated rapidly.
According to the text, while the union members were holding a nighttime meeting at a small church near a lane, a shootout occurred outside the church between armed black union guards and white individuals parked in a car. The gunfire resulted in the death of a white security officer.
The death of a white man at the hands of armed black men sparked a massive, overwhelming reaction. Wild, entirely unsubstantiated rumors spread rapidly through the white population that the Union was actually a front for a massive, coordinated black uprising designed to massacre white citizens.
Utilizing the telegraph and train lines, hundreds of heavily armed white men from across Arkansas and neighboring Mississippi rapidly converged on the Elaine area, essentially forming a massive, heavily armed vigilante mob.
The resulting violence lasted for several terrifying days as the white mob swept through the countryside, hunting down Union members and indiscriminately firing into black homes. Federal troops eventually had to be deployed to restore order.
The exact number of casualties from the massacre has never been definitively established. The source notes that while 5 white men died during the conflict, estimates of the African-American dead range widely, from 20 to well over 200 individuals.
And the aftermath in the local justice system was just as revealing as the violence itself. Following the massacre, the local authorities rapidly indicted and convicted dozens of black men for their involvement in the initial shootout, with trials that lasted mere minutes.
The courts quickly sentenced 12 black men to death by electric chair, while absolutely no white participants in the mob violence were ever charged with the crime.
It is a stark, grim historical fact that perfectly illustrates the reality of the era. The African-American population was violently, systematically excluded from the vision of a new Arkansas. The progressive reforms of the era simply did not extend to protecting the basic civil rights, economic liberty, or even the physical lives of the state's black citizens.
So the state was heavily in debt, spending money it didn't have to build a progressive infrastructure for the white population, all while sitting on a massive powder keg of racial and economic tension. But as the calendar turned to the 1920s, the political focus on progress would violently shift back to simple, desperate survival. A string of biblical-level disasters would wipe out the state's bank accounts, destroy its crops, and fundamentally break the old systems.
When we think of the 1920s from a national perspective, we universally picture the Roaring Twenties, the booming stock market, the rise of jazz, flappers, and massive industrial prosperity.
But for an agricultural state like Arkansas, the 1920s brought a crippling, grinding depression that started nearly a decade before the famous 1929 Wall Street crash. Immediately after World War I, the artificially high wartime prices for cotton absolutely plummeted.
Farmers, who had aggressively taken on high-interest debt to buy more land and tractors during the boom, suddenly found themselves facing total ruin when the price of their crop dropped below the cost of production.
There was one brief, incredibly chaotic flash of massive wealth during this agonizing decade, the El Dorado oil boom in southern Arkansas. The discovery of massive underground oil reserves turned quiet rural towns into lawless, booming boom towns overnight. But even that wealth was a double-edged sword, driven by pure greed and a total lack of regulation.
The environmental mechanics of the oil boom were disastrous.
Yeah.
Independent, highly reckless oil operators, known as wildcatters, were so desperate to extract the oil and get it to market before their competitors that they utilized incredibly wasteful methods.
They tapped into pressurized underground reservoirs that contained both oil and natural gas. Because they only wanted the valuable oil, they simply vented or burned off millions of cubic feet of natural gas into the atmosphere, wasting a massive natural resource.
And the damage to the ground was even worse. As they pumped the oil up, they also pumped up millions of gallons of highly salinated toxic salt water that was trapped in the same geological formations. Instead of properly disposing of it, they just let this toxic brine gather in massive, unlined surface pools.
It breached the pools, permanently salinated the topsoil, and poisoned local streams, rendering thousands of acres of land completely useless for agriculture or timber for decades.
But the localized environmental damage from the chaotic oil boom absolutely paled in comparison to the sheer statewide devastation of the Great Flood in 1927. This was not just a river temporarily overflowing its banks. This is the creation of a massive, terrifying inland sea.
Following months of unprecedented rainfall across the entire Midwest, the levee system along the Mississippi River completely failed. Over 5 million acres in Arkansas were inundated with deep, rushing water. It remains the greatest natural disaster in the state's history since the New Madrid earthquakes a century earlier.
The mechanics of the rescue response marked a massive turning point in how America handles disasters. The American Red Cross stepped in and orchestrated an unprecedented, highly modernized relief operation. For the first time in a natural disaster, they utilized cutting-edge technology.
They used two-way radios to coordinate fleets of rescue boats across the flooded delta, and they utilized airplanes to fly over the submerged landscape to spot desperate refugees clinging to the roofs of their houses or trapped on the remaining slivers of the levees. They established 80 massive, sprawling refugee camps across the high ground of the state to house and feed the displaced population.
And a crucial, highly effective figure in that massive relief effort was an African-American agricultural extension agent named H.C. Ray. Given the highly segregated nature of the era, the Red Cross camps were segregated. Ray was put in charge of organizing the relief efforts for the thousands of Black refugees.
He tirelessly operated soup kitchens, managed sanitation in the sprawling camps, and coordinated the distribution of supplies. It was a monumental logistical effort simply to keep people from starving to death.
But the floodwaters also washed away the facade of the agricultural economy, exposing a deep, systemic rot. The Red Cross medical teams working in the refugee camps discovered a massive, terrifying crisis of pellagra among the Delta sharecroppers.
Pellagra is a horrific, debilitating disease characterized by the 4Ds: dermatitis, diarrhea, dementia, and eventually death. And the medical teams knew it was caused entirely by a severe dietary deficiency, specifically a lack of niacin found in fresh vegetables, milk, and meat.
And this is where the biological reality collides with the economic system. The Red Cross realized this massive pellagra outbreak wasn't just a temporary result of the flood washing away the farmers' vegetable gardens. The sharecroppers didn't have gardens to wash away.
The wealthy planters actively forbade their sharecroppers from using any of the incredibly valuable delta land to grow their own food. Every square inch of soil was mandated for cotton production. Consequently, the sharecroppers were forced to survive year-round on a deeply impoverished diet of salt pork, cornmeal, and molasses purchased at high prices from the planters' commissary.
To stop the refugees from dying of pellagra in the camps, the Red Cross had to literally distribute massive quantities of pure yeast, which is high in niacin en masse, to the sharecroppers. It was a medical band-aid on a massive economic wound.
And when the floodwaters finally receded late in the summer, the institutional efforts to rebuild the agricultural sector heavily favored the wealthy elite. The Arkansas Farm Credit Corporation, established to provide emergency loans to ruined farmers, directed almost all of its financial aid strictly to the large planters.
The justification was that the small independent farmers could simply rely on local credit. But the local banks had all failed in the flood. This deliberate policy pushed thousands of small independent farmers into immediate bankruptcy, forcing them to sell their land and fall into the deeply exploitative, inescapable cycle of tenancy and sharecropping. Wait, so you have an agricultural system that was already collapsing, and then the 1930 drought hit. The rain literally stopped. How did the state government handle this unprecedented dual crisis?
The state's response reveals an immense political irony. In 1932, at the absolute rock bottom of the economic collapse, when citizens are literally starving, the voters of Arkansas elect Governor Junius Marion Futrell.
Futrell was a rigid, uncompromising fiscal conservative to his core. He fundamentally believed that the government's only legitimate function was to balance its own budget.
He ruthlessly slashed state expenditures, dramatically cut funding for public education, and actively, bitterly resisted any state-led relief efforts for the starving farmers, claiming that welfare would bankrupt the state and destroy the moral character of the citizens.
But here is the massive contradiction. At the exact same time they elected the ultra-conservative Futrell to slash the state budget, the citizens of Arkansas voted overwhelmingly for Franklin D. Roosevelt for president, eagerly embracing his promise of a massive, heavily funded, interventionist federal New Deal.
The voters practically recognized that the state government was incapable of saving them. They needed the immense financial power of Washington.
And the influx of federal New Deal programs fundamentally altered the landscape and the economy of Arkansas forever. The primary mechanism for agricultural relief was the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, the AAA.
The economic theory behind the AAA was simple. crop prices were too low because there was a massive oversupply of cotton.
Mm.
To raise prices, you had to reduce the supply. So the federal government actually paid farmers direct cash subsidies to plow up their growing cotton fields and leave the land fallow.
But the implementation of the AAA in the Delta was deeply structurally flawed. The federal subsidy checks were sent directly to the legal landowners, the planters. The explicit intent of the federal law was that the planters would equitably share this federal money with the tenant farmers and sharecroppers who actually did the physical labor and who were now losing their livelihood because the fields were plowed up.
But the reality on the ground was entirely different. Many planters simply kept the massive federal checks for themselves. They used the government money to pay off their own debts and, crucially, to purchase new, efficient tractors.
A single man on a tractor could do the work of a dozen sharecroppers. With the federal government paying them to grow less cotton and the new tractors requiring less labor, the planters systematically evicted thousands of desperate sharecropper families from the land entirely.
This mass eviction created a profound crisis, and this sheer desperation led directly to the formation of the Southern Tenant Farmers Union, or STFU, in northeast Arkansas in 1934.
The STFU was incredibly unique for its time and place because it was an interracial union. Black and white sharecroppers, recognizing that their shared economic destitution was more powerful than the segregation laws dividing them, banded together to fight back against the illegal evictions and demand their rightful share of the federal AAA payments.
The clash between the STFU and the planters was a brutal, violent confrontation over the fundamental control of the agricultural economy. The union members utilized strikes and public protests, which drew national media attention to the horrific living conditions in the Delta.
The planters, determined to maintain absolute control over their workforce and the flow of federal money, responded with severe intimidation, utilizing armed riding bosses and local law enforcement to harass, beat, and arrest union organizers. It forced the federal government in Washington to finally confront the ugly, exploitative realities of the Southern plantation economy that they were accidentally subsidizing.
But while the New Deal caused immense strife in the Delta, its impact in the isolated upland regions of the state was entirely different. Programs like the Works Progress Administration and the Civilian Conservation Corps provided desperate, unemployed men with their very first actual cash wages in years.
They built schools, paved roads, constructed state parks, and built post offices, leaving a physical infrastructure that still exists today.
And perhaps the single most transformative New Deal program for the average Arkansan was the REA, the Rural Electrification Administration. Prior to the REA, electricity was strictly a luxury for the cities. Private power monopolies, like Arkansas Power and Light, which was run by the incredibly powerful executive Harvey Couch, had absolutely zero interest in running expensive power lines miles out into the Ozarks to reach a single poor farm.
There was simply no profit in it. Couch and the private utilities fought the REA bitterly, claiming it was socialism.
But the federal government pushed the program through anyway. The REA provided low-interest federal loans to allow rural farmers to form their own nonprofit electric cooperatives and string their own lines.
Bringing electricity to the rural farms didn't just provide light. It fundamentally transformed the grueling mechanics of daily life. It meant electric water pumps instead of hauling heavy wooden buckets from the creek by hand. It meant electric irons instead of heating solid iron blocks on a wood stove in August.
It meant families could read the newspaper or listen to the radio by a clean light bulb instead of a smoky, dangerous kerosene lamp. It forcibly pulled rural Arkansas out of the 19th century.
By the dawn of World War II, the ruggedly independent Arkansas farmer had become intimately tied to the federal government just to survive.
Exactly.
We've covered an incredible journey today. From a shallow ocean floor dividing the state's geography to the violent growing pains of statehood, the devastation of the Civil War, the flawed progressive era, and the biblical disasters of the 20s and 30s.
Think about the resilience required to inhabit this space. If geography is destiny, as we saw with the geological divide, is Arkansas's true identity defined by the rich land it sits on, or by the relentless cycle of natural and man-made disasters that have continually forced its people to reinvent themselves?
That's a great question to leave you with. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep exploring the hidden histories in your own backyard.